WLC presents, brought to you by the donations of our faithful partners.
Shalom, shalom, and welcome back to our program, The End Declared Right Out of the Beginning. Once again, we got a lot of material to cover, so we're just going to get right back into it. The last time we were together, we were talking about the difference in the thinking processes. And now we're going to start to go into some teaching that is related to the concept of Agri-bio Linguistics. I want to show you the relationship in the Bible, the synonymous relationship between language, biology, and agriculture, the things that you see out in the field. But before we do that, there's one more thinking process I want to mention before we go on. And that is the difference between Western form thinking and Eastern, or if you will, Hebrew function thinking. There's a difference between thinking of things in terms of form and thinking of God's teaching in the terms of function. Now let me give you an example of form thinking. In form thinking, we have a tendency to be concerned with what things look like. In Hebrew, the focus is on the function of something, not necessarily what it looks like. But see, we're trained in a form way of thinking. Let me give you an example. If I had a Greek man, if I was standing to a Greek man and I walked up to a Greek man and I said, "Tell me about a pencil." The Greek man would go, "Well, it's about 6 inches long and they're yellow and they got a little red eraser and a little piece of lead on the end there." The Greek man would tell me what it looks like. Now, if I walked up to a Hebrew man, if you will, if I can use that term, and asked him the exact same question, the Hebrew man would say, "I write with it." So the Hebrew would tell me, biblical Hebrew, not modern Orthodox Judaism today, would tell me the function of it. He would give me how it operated and what the purpose and design of the pencil was. The Western thinking man, however, would tell me all about what things look like and so forth. That's why I submit to you once again that much of rabbinical Judaism has been Hellenized and Greekized because they focus a whole lot on that, missing the whole object of function and so forth. As a matter of fact, when you read, for example, your New Testament, especially the red words, of course that would be the words of Yeshua, one of the first things we learn about Yeshua is we learn a lot about the things he said and the things he did. In Hebrew, that's called your fruit, the things you say and the things that you do. And so we learn a lot about the function of the Messiah and the reason why he took upon flesh and so on and so forth. And you'll notice that we know very little about what he looked like. We know very little about what the Messiah looked like. As a matter of fact, we know very little about what any of the writers of the Bible look like. Do you know why? Hebrew doesn't care. Hebrew's not concerned about what they look like. Hebrew concerns itself with what they did. But see, we live in a culture where we're constantly forced into what things look like rather than their function and so forth. Now, for example, when you read your Old Testament, we get the dimensions of Noah's Ark, and we get the dimensions of the temple and the tabernacle and so forth. Now, the reason those dimensions are given to you and I is not so we can run off and draw out a nice little nifty picture of it. The reason why we're given those dimensions is so we understand the function of those objects, the function of the tabernacle, the function of the temple, the function of the ark, Noah's Ark and so forth. That's why we're given those dimensions. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I'm going to submit to you that we've been looking for the anti-Messiah, if you will, for decades, for centuries, based upon form rather than function. Based upon what he looks like. So for years we've been going through this character after this character after this character while we're talking about, well, was he black? Was he white? Was he Jew? Was he Gentile? Was it WWW? Is it Ronald Wilson Reagan? As we go through the litany of what everything looked like, while we've been looking for the form of the anti-Messiah, he's been functioning right in our midst all this time while we're out there looking for some dude to come through the door. Okay? And so it's important to understand the difference between function thinking and form thinking. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about Agri-bio Linguistics. But before we do that, grab your Bible and turn to the book of James with me for just a moment. The book of James, chapter 3, in Hebrew is Yaakov, erroneously, and I mean erroneously, translated as James. But nonetheless, that's the way it appears in our English Bibles. When you read the book of James, one of the first things you're going to realize in chapter 3 is the context of chapter 3. Some of you are familiar with this section of verses between chapter 3, verse 1 and 6. It begins by saying this, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that ye shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many ways we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Behold also the ships, though they be great, are driven of fierce winds, yet they are turned about with a little small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth," and so on and so forth. A lot of fancy King James English. "Even so, the tongue is a little member, and boasts great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth." Now I'm going to hold off on verse 6 for a minute because I want you to get the context of this. The context begins with teachers have a greater accountability than everybody else. Why? Because teachers teach words. Words mean things. Words manipulate. Words guide how a culture goes. Remember I told you earlier that you want to change the behavior of the people? Change the language. Change the meaning of words, because that will determine and guide a culture's behavior. And so there's a warning for those of us who teach. I take that warning very seriously because I know the result of teaching someone something that's wrong. So I take it very seriously. And then Yaakov goes on and talks about the fact that this little tongue in our mouth defiles and manipulates such a great thing, such a little thing in our mouth. Such great things it does. Now, when he talks about the tongue in our mouth, he's not really talking about this wagging thing in our mouth. He's talking about the things we say. He's using the English word tongue, but he's talking about the words or the teaching that comes off our lips. Manipulates and defiles the whole body many times. And so that's the context. So when we get to verse 6, as you can see up on your screen, Yaakov chapter 3 verse 6 says this, and follow along with me. "And the tongue," that is the words that are being spoken, "is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defiles the whole body, and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell." Sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. Now you wouldn't grasp it just looking at the King James English there. Sets on fire the course of nature. That English phrase, course of nature, I'm not even going to take it back to the Hebrew. I'm just going to go back to the Greek because I want to make a point here. In the Greek, this phrase, course of nature, in Greek is literally, in the Greek, the wheels or cycles of Genesis. It literally says that this tongue, the things that we teach, the words that come out of our mouth, sets on fire the wheels or cycles of Genesis. Now the reason why I believe this says this is because God's cycles are already presented to us in the very beginning. And it's teaching. And those cycles are what guide us in our lives, not just the agricultural things out the window, but everything we teach our children over and over and over from one generation to the next. Because if we maintain those cycles that God gave us in the beginning, His festivals, His feast, His Sabbaths, His dietary laws, His commandments, and so forth, if we maintain those cycles throughout every generation, then guess what? The generation at the end sees the same truth as the generation in the beginning. In other words, don't change those cycles because you'll change the end. Now remember, Isaiah told us that the end is revealed right out of the beginning. So you skew the picture that's being painted through our obedience to these pictures from the very beginning by messing them up along the way. And therefore you mess up the picture in the end. And so these cycles are given in Genesis. As a matter of fact, it's my belief, and I'm not going to go into detail with it right now because it would take hours to go through the detail. It's my opinion that these cycles that God is talking about are two kinds of cycles. The 7,000-year cycle of man, days is 1,000 years and so forth, that man has a cycle. The life cycle of mankind is 7,000 years. And it's a cycle that goes real slow. How do I know that? It takes 7,000 years. And then the cycle or the wheel that goes much faster, the yearly cycle of God's feast and festivals and Sabbaths and so forth, is the inner hub. And that is exactly what Ezekiel's wheel is all about. Because he says to take this vision of a wheel within a wheel and take it to the rebellious house of Israel. Why does he say that? Because they had turned from God's ways and were doing things their own ways rather than God's ways. And so if you corrupt the inner wheel, which goes much faster because that's on a yearly basis, you corrupt the outer wheel. You corrupt the inner wheel, you corrupt the outer wheel. And these things are revealed in the natural things of creation from the very beginning. Now, let's get into the concept. Let's continue with this concept a little bit of this cyclical thinking. On your screen is the verse from Bereshit, Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. Here's an example of these cycles I want to talk about. It says, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. As long as we are up on the planet here, as long as the earth remains, we're going to continue to have these cycles represented for us right outside our window. And then it goes on to say in Psalm 23:3, remember that verse? He restores my soul. He leads me in the cycles of righteousness for His name's sake. It says cycles of righteousness in Hebrew. Another example is even in archaeology. When we go to archaeology, some of you are familiar with the study of archaeology. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I encourage in my personal life, and I hope that you would too, there's 3 things you ought to encourage. Number 1, we ought to be encouraging astronomers to look deep into the recesses of outer space, looking for the origin of life. I think we ought to encourage that. I think we ought to encourage physicists and biologists, biophysicists and biologists and geneticists and so forth, looking inside the deep recesses of a cell, looking for the origin of life. I think we ought to encourage that. I think we ought to encourage archaeologists to keep digging in the ground, looking for the source of where things come from. Do you know why? Because I am confident in my God. I am confident enough in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that He already knows that astronomers are looking for the origin of life. He already knows that biologists and physicists or geneticists are looking for the origin of life. He already knows that. And so because He knows that, I am confident that when they finally find the origin of life, guess who's going to be standing right in front of them? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're going to be staring Him right in the face. And it's very interesting to me that even the word archaeology testifies of everything that we're talking about going back to the beginning. Archaeology literally means the study of Bereshit or Genesis. It's the Hebrew word Bereshit we translate as Genesis in our English Bibles. Because the very first 2 words of your Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the Greek version of your Old Testament is in arche, in the beginning, arche, ology. Ology, of course, we translate as the study of. Arche is the beginning. Archaeology technically is the study of the very beginning. And I'm always encouraging that, and I think you should encourage that too. Okay, let's go back to our verses. Let's go back to the beginning as we discuss the subject of archaeology. In Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, here's what it says. It says, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in himself upon the earth. And it was so. Now in your King James Bible it says after its kind, whose seed was in itself. But in Hebrew, it's in the masculine gender here. It says that the fruit tree yields fruit after his kind, whose seed was in himself. So I submit to you that it's talking about something far more profound than just fruit trees and seeds in trees and so forth. Once again, I believe it's speaking